Hi everybody, my name is Yvette Martel and welcome to Art 301 Foundations of Art. This is lecture 3 on formalism, the elements of art, and the principles of design. Now this lecture is a bit on the longer side, so I've included 2 breaks. What I'd love for you to do is when you see the actual break is to pause, go ahead and grab a glass of water, stretch your legs, and that way the amount of information that you're going to be receiving will be a bit more digestible. So let's get started. So welcome to Formalism, and in this week's lecture, we'll connect our philosophical discussion to the fundamental language of art. We will explore formalism and the theory of art that focuses on an artwork's visual elements. We'll learn the 7+7, the 7 elements of art, and the 7 principles of design. The elements of art are the fundamental building blocks used to create art, while the principles of design are the rules for how those elements are organized. What is formalism? Formalism is a theory of art that focuses on an artwork's form and visual qualities, rather than the subject matter, the story, or the historical context. A formalist approach asks us to look at the visual evidence in the work itself. We ask, how is this artwork made, rather than what is this artwork about? This approach is a critical tool for learning how to read art and understand the choices an artist has made. The elements of art. These are our building blocks. We have line, shape, form, color, value, texture, and shape. These building blocks of all visual art, and they're the basic components or visual tools that artists use to create and communicate in their work. The first is line. Line is a mark with length and direction that defines shape, edges, and movement. Here we have Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night. Van Gogh uses the swirly expressive lines to create a sense of motion in the sky, guiding the viewer's eye and evoking emotional intensity. Critically thinking, the formalist perspective would be, how do the swirling and curling lines in Starry Night guide the viewer's eye to create a sense of movement within the composition? Shape. Shape is a flat, enclosed area created by lines, color, and contrast. Frida Kahlo, The Two Fridas, 1939. Kahlo's bold shapes of the two figures and their clothing emphasize duality and identity with a strong contrast between the mirrored selves. Critically thinking, how do the repeated shapes of the two Fridas communicate? How do the repeated shapes of the two Fridas communicate ideas about identity, and what might Frida Kahlo's be suggesting about her inner life? Form. Three-dimensional object that has height, width, and depth. Here we have Michelangelo's David. Michelangelo's sculpture demonstrates a mastery of form with a lifelike anatomy and depth, making the marble figure appear to be realistic and full of volume. Critically thinking, how does Michelangelo's use of proportion, contour, and three-dimensional modeling to emphasize David's form? Space. Space is the area around, between, and within an object in a composition. Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. Leonardo uses linear perspective to create depth, guiding the viewer's eye to Christ at the center and organizing the figures in harmony with the architecture. Critically thinking is, how does Leonardo's use of linear perspective in architectural space organize the composition and focus attention on Christ? Color. Color is the element produced by light reflecting off objects consisting of hue, value, and intensity. Salvador Dali's The Persistence of Memory, 1931. Dali's warm browns and cool blues create a surreal, dreamlike atmosphere with color contrast heightening the tension between natural and unnatural elements. So how does Dali's contrast of warm and cool colors create tension and define different areas of the composition? Value. Value is the lightness or darkness of a color used to create contrast and emphasis. Here we have Artemites Gentileschi's Judith and her maidservant with the head of Olafert, 1625. So this female painter uses dramatic candlelight and shadow to heighten drama and direct attention. How does this manipulation of light and shadow control focus and create a dramatic intensity? Texture. Texture is the way the surface looks or feels, either real or implied. Here we have the teacup, saucer, and spoon covered with gazelle fur. The texture surface feels unsettling, almost tempting to the touch, significantly altering the object's purpose. This one is implied texture. So in implied texture, it creates lifelike textures in this monumental canvas with detailed brushwork. She suggests horsehair ground beneath the hooves and the flowing clothes to make the flat paint feel tangible. So the painting basically feels real. So here we have this portrait. So this portrait provides the texture of the fur and the glass and the wood and the fabric to precisely feel that the viewer's richness, we can feel the richness of the material. So how does the rendering of the surface texture enhance the illusion of materiality and depth? All right, we're here for our first break. Go ahead and take that, stretch your legs, go grab a glass of water. And what I would love for you to do is go back over the actual slides and look at the artwork a little bit more closely and look at those formalistic perspective questions. And we're back. The principles of design. Now the principles, these are the rules, okay? These are the rules or the guidelines that help an artist use to organize the elements of art in an effective way. We have balance, contrast, emphasis, movement, pattern, proportion, rhythm, and unity. The first is balance. Notice the different kinds of balances that are illustrated. This is the distribution of the visual weight of a work of art to create a sense of stability. Here we have George O'Keeffe, Black Iris, number 3, 1926. O'Keeffe creates a balance through the symmetrical unfolding of the petals, but slight variations in color and form prevent it from being rigid. The result is a harmonious yet dramatic echoing the natural balance of growth. So critically thinking, how does O'Keeffe use symmetry and variation in form and color to establish visual balance without rigidity? Contrast. Contrast is the arrangement of opposite elements, light versus dark, rough versus smooth, large versus small, to create a visual interest. In Barbara Kruger's Untitled, Your Body is a Battleground, 1989, Kruger contrasts black and white photography with bold red text. The sharp visual opposition amplifies her feminist message, forcing the viewer to confront it directly. Critically thinking, how does Kruger's juxtaposition of the black and white photograph create how does Kruger's juxtaposition of black and white photography with bold red text create a strong visual contrast that commands attention? Emphasis. Emphasis is the part of a composition that draws the viewer's attention first. Here we have Diego Rivera's Man, Controller of the Universe, 1934. Rivera emphasizes the central worker surrounding by machines, planets, and social symbols. By placing him at the center, Rivera communicates the power and the responsibility of people in shaping the modern world. Critically thinking is how does Rivera's placement of the central figure and the surrounding details direct visual emphasis towards the worker? Movement. Movement is the part of a composition that draws the viewer's attention first. Here we have Jackson Pollock's Autumn Rhythm, number 30, 1950. Pollock's energetic drips and splatters lead the eye unpredictably in all directions. This creates a sense of visual rhythm and physical action that mirrors the artist's own movement. Critically thinking is how does Pollock's overlapping drips and directional lines guide the viewer's eye rhythmically across the canvas. It's kind of crazy, right? Pattern. All right, pattern. Pattern is the repetition of elements in a predictable arrangement. So here we have M.C. Escher's Sky and Water 1, 1938. So Escher creates these interlocking birds and fish using tessellization and forming a seamless pattern that transitions between sky and water. So critically thinking, how does Escher's repeated tessellated shapes and patterns create that transition that smoothly is between the birds and the fish? Proportion. Proportion is a relationship between the different parts of a work of art. Here we have Michelangelo's Pieta. Michelangelo enlarges Mary in scale relative to Christ to balance the composition and create a harmonious triangular form. Critically thinking, how does Michelangelo's manipulation of the proportion between Mary and Christ create compositional harmony? Rhythm and unity. Rhythm creates a sense of visual tempo, and unity brings together all the elements into a cohesive whole. Here we have Tree of Life, 1909. Klimt repeats the swirling golden forms throughout the pattern, creating a visual, these repeated swirling golden forms throughout the painting create a rhythmic flow while unifying the composition through color and pattern. How does this repetition of swirling lines and golden color unify the composition while creating a rhythmic flow? All right, so now we're at break number 2, okay? So we've gone through the elements of art, we've gone through the principles of design. Please go ahead and take that break of yours, stretch your legs, and like I said, go back, go over those slides and review a bit. All right, so we're back from our break. What I want to do is take a second and kind of connect some of the dots a little bit deeper. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to think even further. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at formalism and we're going to kind of compare that to other perspectives. And that'll kind of help to connect some of the dots. So we're going to go back over many of the pieces that we went to, and we're going to look at different critical thinking perspectives. In our first one, if you remember Starry Night, our formalist perspective was, we asked the question, how do the swirling and curving lines in Starry Night guide the viewer's eye to create a sense of movement within the composition? If we were to change that perspective to a more emotional, expressive perspective, we would ask, how does Van Gogh's swirling lines change the way you feel about the night sky compared to a more realistic straight line depiction? Here's David again. So the formalist perspective, we're asking, how does Michelangelo use proportion, contour, and three-dimensional modeling to emphasize David's form? If we to switch that to a historical contextual perspective, we would ask, why do you think Michelangelo chose to represent David in such a naturalistic and idealistic form? And how might this reflect Renaissance value? With our Last Supper, the formalist perspective, Leonardo's work, we're asking, how does Leonardo's use of linear perspective in architectural space organize the composition and focus attention on Christ? If we were to change the perspective to a more interpretive, contextual perspective, we would ask, how does Leonardo's use of space affect the way we interpret the relationship among the figures in the Last Supper? Critically thinking, as a formalist for Dali's work, we saw the question earlier, how does Dali's contrast of warm and cool colors create tension and define different areas of composition? If we were to change that to a more psychological or contextual perspective, we would ask, how does Dali's color choices shape the dreamlike, almost unsettling feeling of the painting? In the formalist perspective for Gentileschi's manipulation of their light, we would ask, how does Gentileschi's manipulation of light and shadow and value control the focus and the dramatic intensity? If we were to change that to a more emotional, expressive critical thinking question. The perspective would get us to ask the question is, how does Gentileschi's use of candlelight and shadow shape your emotional response to Judith and her maidservant? Do you see them as heroic, fearful, or something else? O'Keeffe's formalist perspective would be, how does O'Keeffe use symmetry and variation in form and color to establish visual balance without rigidity? In an emotional interpretive perspective, we would ask, how does O'Keeffe's balanced composition make her flower feel more stable or more alive? In Kruger's formalist perspective, we would ask, again, how does Kruger's juxtaposition of black and white photography with bold red text create a strong visual contrast that demands attention? If we were to change that perspective to a more political, conceptual, a more message-driven perspective, we would ask, how does Kruger's use of visual contrast strengthen the political urgency of her message? Jackson Pollock. The formalist perspective, we would ask, how does Pollock's overlapping drips and directional lines guide the viewer's eyes rhythmically across the canvas? In a more experiential, immersive and emotional perspective, we would ask, how does Pollock's use of movement make you feel as if you're a part of the process of painting itself? Rivera's formalistic perspective. How does Rivera's placement of the central figure and the surrounding details direct the viewer's emphasis towards the worker? In a more socio-political, ideological, or interpretation, we would ask, how does Rivera's choice to emphasize the worker alter how we think about technology, labor, and progress? In Escher's piece, The Formalist Perspective, how does Escher repeated tessellated shapes use patterns that transition smoothly between the birds and the fish? If we look at it more symbolically, we would ask, what symbolic ideas might Escher's repeated birds and fish suggest about the relationship between the natural worlds? Michelangelo's piece, as a formalist, we would ask, how does Michelangelo's manipulation of the proportions between Christ and Mary create a compositional harmony? In the historical contextual perspective, we would ask, why do you think Michelangelo exaggerated Mary's size in relation to Christ? And how does that shape the meaning of the sculpture? All right, we're almost there. So in our formalist perspective, how does Klimt's repetition of the swirling lines in golden color unify the composition while creating rhythmic flow? In our more symbolic and spiritual perspective, we would ask, what spiritual or symbolic ideas might be repeated in the spirals, and how might that suggest about life and about nature? All right, we did it. Like I said, it was a long lecture. Hopefully you did take those breaks. And what I would really encourage you to do, okay, because I went through this lecture rather fast. If I was in person, this would be a very long lecture, and I'd probably break this up in 2 days, to be realistic. So please go over all the slides. Go back over everything you've gotten. Take the time to look at the work and take the time to look at those critical questions and then compare it to the other, the different perspectives to really get a deeper understanding of this formalist perspective. So in wrapping up, you've learned the essential vocabulary of art with the elements of art and the principles of design. Remember, these are not just vocabulary words, they are analytical tools that you can use to help understand and critique any artwork. Thanks so much, everybody. I am so glad to have the honor of teaching you. Have a great day.